final installment of our pre-Pesach learning series. I have to say, although it's been intense, it's also been really wonderful to spend this time with you, somewhat in Zoom, some of it in person. We're really proud of how much time and thought and learning has made the last couple of weeks the perfect preparation for what I hope will be a very meaningful Pesach for one and all. We were thrilled to start our program off a couple of weeks ago with Rabbi Genek's annual class on Hilchos Pesach. We studied about Erev Pesach Shechalios B'Shabbos. We were able to host our rabbinic intern, Rabbi Kupferberg, who's with us tonight for a Shabbos of learning in person this past weekend. We were honored to host Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman from Yeshiva University to address us the Shabbos Haggadah Drasha. And now we're able to turn our attention to the Haggadah with a focus on sharing Divrei Torah with you this evening that I hope will be the kinds of Divrei Torah that you can think about with your families and with your friends, the people you're spending the Seder with. Hopefully it'll enhance your experience and the experience of those around you. Tonight's program is being generously sponsored by Susan and David Tessel in memory of Susan's mother, Irma Shulman Weiner. Susan lost her mother during a very difficult year in which many of us lost people that we loved. And certainly that was the case for Susan and David, and the loss of Irma, Zichrona Livracha. But Susan said to me that she wanted to do something special, not only for her family and in her mother's memory, but something that would bring happiness to our community, to bring some joy to each of us before we got to the holiday of Pesach that we celebrate in just a few days. And the idea that we came up with together was to devote our attention to one of the great minds of our generation, perhaps the greatest spokesman of Jewish ideas in the last many years and decades, who we also lost during this very difficult year, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichron Livracha. And the Haggadah that the Tessel sponsored, that many of our members have registered and already received a beautiful copy of, this beautiful Haggadah and the essays that are included within it are just one of the many incredible contributions that Rabbi Sacks made to the great corpus of Jewish history, and also in particular to the great literature of the Haggadah. Jews have been writing about the Haggadah since as early as we've been writing about pretty much anything else. And Rabbi Sacks, in his own unique way, calls our attention to the morals and the issues of our moment through the timeless text of the Haggadah. And I'm sure that reading it will bring a lot of happiness and inspiration to you and your families. I want to thank everyone who registered in advance and thank the Tessels for this wonderful idea and making it possible. Tonight, we'll be taking advantage of the Zoom technology and going around with Rabbi Genek and Rabbi Kupferberg in some kind of virtual round robin. I don't know how much order there will be to this Seder night for us. It might be the anti-Seder in terms of our presentation, but we'll work our way back and forth and through the text of the Haggadah in a meaningful fashion. We've also selected some highlights from the Sacks Haggadah that inspired us in our study this year that we hope to share with you so that you're able to look at these essays in particular and hopefully add a little bit more of depth and meaning to your Seder as well. To kick things off, I'll mute myself and turn it over to Rabbi Genek.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zirkind. And thank you to the Tessel family for dedicating tonight in honor of Susan's mother's yahrzeit and memory. It's really such a great pleasure to discuss the Haggadah with colleagues. There's so much to talk about and to play off of. And I actually, before we talk about the Haggadah, I wanted to actually kick it off before the Haggadah. And I think it's a meaningful place to begin, as we'll see in a moment. So when the Rambam wrote his Haggadah in the 8th chapter of Hilchos Chametz U'Matzah, so he starts as follows. And this is each of my different Torah comes from a different Haggadah. This one comes from one of my favorites, Siach HaGrid, which is Rav Soloveitchik's Haggadah. It was written by his grandson, Rav Yitzi Lichtenstein, who is now the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Torah Das, the son of Aaron Lichtenstein of Gush. And these are the conversations that he had with his grandfather before Pesach and at the Seder himself. And the Rav observed that when the Rambam begins his description of the Seder, he says as follows. He says, Seder asiyas mitzvos elu belel chamish asar kachu. He says, this is how you perform the mitzvos on the night of the 15th at your Seder. What's the first thing you do? Betchila mozgin kos l'chol echad ve'echad. The first thing you do is you pour everybody's cup. And then afterwards you start with Kaddish. And the Rav noted that it's an interesting place to begin your Seder Hayom, that you have to begin the Seder with pouring the cups. It says, and these are the mitzvahs of the night. The Rav asked, let's say you wanted to get your Seder ready early, and when you put your Haggadahs out, and you set the table, and you arrange your pillows, you filled all the cups of wine. It seems from the Rambam that would not be sufficient. The wine has to be poured at night, during the Seder itself. And the Rav asks, why would that be? Why is it so important? And the truth is that the Rambam is reflecting the language of the Mishnah in Maseches Psachim. And the Rav suggests that pouring the wine is not just the prerequisite to obviously making the brachos of the Dalet Kosos. He says, no, pouring the wine into the cups is actually an integral part of the bracha itself, of the mitzvos of the Dalet Kosos. And he says, I'll prove it to you. You know, we don't often say Berkas Hamazon, bench al hakos, while using a cup of wine. We happen to do it on the night of the Seder. But it's not so common anymore. But in the olden days, they always did it. And the Rambam, the halacha is, the Gemara tells us, that in the olden days that they would actually pour the wine, or they would add water to the wine. They would dilute their wine during benching itself. They would start benching, and in the middle of the first bracha, they would add water to their wine. And that's always how it was. They'd start benching, the person who's the mizame would hold the cup, and then in the middle of the first bracha, they would add water to the wine. That was always the Seder, always the process of benching. The Rav shows that you see that the pouring of the wine and the water into the wine is actually part of the bracha. They would almost interrupt benching to do it. So the Rav said that's why you need to pour the wine of the Seder after nightfall. We know you can't start saying Kaddish until nightfall. You can't even start pouring the wine for Kaddish until nightfall. You know, there's always the jostling. You want to make sure that you can start as early as possible. Make sure that the salt water is ready and the charoses is ground. So maybe you'll want to pour the wine early. No, you have to wait until tseis to pour the wine. And I think this speaks to a minhag that many of us have, that we don't pour our own wine, that each person has their cup poured for them by somebody else. Why is that? That's the pouring of the wine. Does that really matter? As the Rav demonstrated, yes. The pouring of the wine is actually the first component of the Seder, and we show that we are free. We show that we're joyous and celebratory by having somebody else pour our wine for us. And what this highlights is that the preparation for the Seder, the anticipation of the Seder, is so much a part of the experience. And Rabbi Zirkin and Rabbi Kupferberg, that's why I think it's so exciting to be able to discuss it now. You know, we still have a couple of days till the Seder, till it starts, and we're already anticipating it. We're already, I'm in my office, right across the hall. People are koshering their kalim, obviously, while they're listening to the shir at the same time. There's so much preparation, so much excitement, and each moment of that excitement is a stage, is a part of the process of celebrating Pesach. And it really comes, the first step, or the last step of the preparation, and the first step of the Seder is actually the preparation, the pouring of the wine. And that's what the Rav sees in the Seder itself of the Rambam.
It's amazing. I'm glad nobody's being mosaic their kosos right now. They're eager, but they're not that eager. Or maybe that's the people who are drinking already have their cameras off. That's the great Zoom technique. Either way, it's the season of Simcha. The Magid begins with Halach Ma'anya. And Halach Ma'anya is a very curious and memorable introduction to Magid that always inspires us to ask more or less the same kind of questions. And perhaps the classic questions, I see some of you are cooking while cooking and koshering at the same time. That's really inspiring. So we're doing Magid and we're preparing the Seder. It reminds me of one of the years where I was in Israel. I had Seder with family of one of my classmates in Kerem B'Yavneh, whose parents had made Aliyah. So the boys were all keeping 2 days of Yantif, but the parents had made Aliyah. They were making 1 day of Yantif. So while we had second Seder, his parents were kind enough to cook for us. They were making the Seder as we were doing Magid. It was probably the freshest meal I've ever eaten in my life. I didn't have to do any of the preparation, just sing the songs. So we get to Halach Ma'anya, and we're always thinking about these classic questions. The question of Kol Dichvin Yesev Yechal, who exactly are you inviting in? I remember my mashgiach in school describing it this way in yeshiva. He would say, you lock the doors and you close the window shades and you sit down and you don't feel like moving for a long time. And then you kind of yell, if anybody wants to come in, you're, well, who are you talking to? Who exactly are you inviting in? That, of course, is very curious, but also the nusach of the Haggadah. Most of the Haggadah appears in Mishnaic Hebrew. And of course, Halach Ma'anya, if you're intimidated about the text of the Seder, this is a tough place to start. All of a sudden, you're in the Aramaic. Lach Ma'anya, Diachalu, Avasana, Ba'ara, de Mitzrayim. We could have seen it being in Lashon HaKodesh, would have been a little bit easier for us to read. The Abarbanel, who we're familiar with from his lengthy commentary to the Chumash, the Abarbanel has a Haggadah as well. And in his Haggadah, he picks up on this second question. Why is the Aramaic here being used as opposed to the Lashon HaKodesh in the language of Halach Ma'anya? And he makes a very powerful point. He suggests that the reason for this is because it was inserted into the Haggadah after the Jewish people went into Galus. And he says after it's in that sense maybe frozen in time as a memory from the Jews in Bavel inviting each other in. There was probably a point in time, he says, we can envision this, where the infrastructure of celebrating Pesach in Yerushalayim was such that if people were less fortunate, if they couldn't afford a Karban Pesach, if they didn't have family that they could be with, hospitality was so much easier because even though it was chaotic, everybody was together. And then the Jews went out into Galus and they discovered making Pesach more complicated than ever before, not to mention the sheer fact that trying to make Yontif in exile, not this kind of exile where you can have everything contactless, drop off and pick up. The original exile where things were really difficult, it was hard for them. And in that moment, when they realized that what's everyone going to do for Pesach? Some are more fortunate, some are less fortunate, some are more equipped, some are less equipped. They realized that they needed to take care of each other. This was the language that they used. Kol dich ben yesev yechel. It was an expression of exile in exile. And we have kind of frozen that moment in time using that language at the very beginning of our Seder, saying it is an important piece of who and what we are. That if that infrastructure crumbles around us, we have to find a new way to care for others and a new way to make sure that every single person is able to celebrate Pesach in the right way. And this, to me, reminds me of one of my favorite comments from Rabbi Sachs, also on these lines of Halach Ma'anya. And if you have the Sachs Haggadah, you can find this on page 23, 24, and 25, where Rabbi Sachs talks about the idea of sharing with others. And he tells a very powerful story from the autobiography of Primo Levi, which I'm just going to read to you very briefly. It's on page 25 in the Haggadah. There was a death march happening, and there were Jews in the camp, but the camp was unsupervised by guards. And this is how Primo Levi describes that moment. When the broken window was repaired and the stove began to spread its heat, something seemed to relax in everyone. And at that moment, Towarowski, a Franco-Pole of 23, proposed to the others that each of them offer a slice of bread to us three who had been working. And so it was agreed. Only a day before a similar event would have been inconceivable. The law of the concentration camp said, eat your own bread, and if you can, eat the bread of your neighbor, and left no room for gratitude. It really meant that the law of the lagger was dead. It was the first human gesture that occurred among us. I believe that that moment can be dated as the beginning of the change by which we who had not died slowly changed from prisoners to men again. The moment that they stopped fighting for their own bread and started to have a moment to give bread to others. And so Rabbi Sachs concludes, sharing food is the first act through which slaves become free human beings. One who fears tomorrow doesn't offer his bread to others, but one who's willing to divide his food with a stranger has already shown himself capable of fellowship and faith, the two things from which hope is born. That is why we begin the Seder by inviting others to join us. Bread shared is no longer the bread of oppression. Reaching out to others, giving help to the needy, and the companionship to those who are alone, we bring freedom into the world, and with freedom, God. So perhaps that gives us a little bit of a sense of the moral calling of the Haggadah, that not only is the Haggadah a celebration of our own freedom, but a call to action to make sure that we're thinking deeply about the people around us, to make sure in the spirit of Kol Tich Ben Yeseh V'Yechal that we use the freedom that Hashem gives us to make sure that we have enough gratitude to share with others. Rabbi Genack, we're going to turn it back to you.
Back to me. I just want to comment on what you were saying. It's really beautiful, the concept of freedom from. I think so that there are trends within philosophy that call freedom from and freedom to. I mean, you have freedom from slavery, but that provides you with the obligation to have freedom to care for others. I think that was really beautiful.
Charas and cheras.
Ooh, very good. Charas and cheras.
But it has to be. Charas al aluchos, the Gemara tells us, in lecha ben chorin, al misha osek b'Torah. So what does it mean? It means freedom from Egypt is freedom to Torah, is freedom to Hashem. Avadim to Hashem.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So, my turn. I want to talk about the four sons. And the four sons is one of the most poignant parts of the Maggid. And I want to talk about it from a little different perspective. Just as a mashal, there's a poem written by the Ibn Ezra called Igeres HaShabbos. Right, Zerk, you know Igeres HaShabbos, right? Cover for cover, you know Igeres HaShabbos? You've heard of this?
Nope.
Kufr for sure knows about Igeres HaShabbos. We're not gonna put you on the spot. Either way,
Yeah,
Igeres HaShabbos is a poem. What? Yeah,
yeah, I've heard it.
you've heard of it. I
Beautiful.
can't.
The
It's
two
very
of you can
beautiful.
sing it together if you'd like.
Yeah. It's so Igeres HaShabbos. I came across it in a class in Revel on Spanish poetry. So the Ibn Ezra, the great Ibn Ezra, was a Spanish poet, and he writes this poem, which is an imagination of a dream. I don't think it's really a dream that he had, but he imagines having a dream, and in this dream, he meets a malach. And the malach, it's a Friday night. He falls asleep after the Suda, he writes, and he sees a malach, and the malach gives him a letter. And Ibn Ezra says to the malach, well, what's this letter that you're giving me? And the malach says it's a letter from Shabbos. And the Ibn Ezra reads this letter, and Shabbos is giving him musar. It's interesting. Then the letter, the poem continues with why Shabbos is giving him musar, and basically he has it channels it into something that's related to a halachic conversation. But the concept of seeing something that's a manifestation of Shabbos, as a personification of Shabbos, is just so powerful. And with that image, I want to introduce another image. The four sons is a similar type of thing going on. The Torah tells us 4 times in the Chumash that there's a mitzvah to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim on the night of the Seder V'gad Tevincha b'yamahu lemor. You have to tell this story, and it tells it the 4 times in the Chumash. We're told to do this, and what the story of the 4 sons is, the image of the 4 sons is a personification of these 4 texts, these 4 psukim. Imagine you have a Sefer Torah in front of you and you have it rolled out, and out of the Sefer Torah 4 people emerge, each one representing the pasuk of you have to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Imagine those 4 people, and what would those 4 people look like? Those are the 4 sons, the Chacham, the Rasha, the Tam, and the Ein Yodei Elishel. And what the Medrash does over here, what the Haggadah does over here, is it imagines these four psukim as if they're family members. And each family member, they're all similar. They grew up in the same home, and they maybe have similar personalities. But there are nuances, just like the psukim. They all say you have to tell the story, but each pasuk says it a little bit differently. This one has a question. This one doesn't have a question. This one has a full explanation. This one has a short explanation. And in the imagination of the personification of these psukim, we have a whole family, and they're interacting with each other. And this brings me to a passage in Rav Sachs Haggadah. I want to read it. It's on page 37, commenting on the four sons. The Rav Sachs has something very interesting to say. He says, "Yet there's a message of hope in the family portrait. Though they disagree, they sit around the same table telling the same story. Each of these four psukim, each of these four children, is at the family table. Though they differ, they stay together. They are part of a single family. Even the rebel is there, although part of him doesn't want to be. This too is who we are." And what Ray Sachs is, he's fleshing out the mushal. The four sons is a mushal how we interact, not just with each other, that's what it's actually about, but it's a mushal how we interact with the Torah and how we see the nuances in the conversations with the Torah. We're supposed to, as we read about the four sons, look closely at the psukim. Each time it says a pasuk, and you look at the Haggadah, and it highlights each of those psukim. We have to realize that each one is very nuanced, and each one is an individual approach. And I want to call to your attention, the Haggadah really it has two parts. There's the Haggadah part on the Hebrew side, from the right side, and starting from the left are essays. And I want to call to your attention an essay that Ray Sachs has on the four sons. What he develops, it's on page 141. You don't have to look at it now, but I really encourage you to read it sometime before or during Pesach. It's called "The Wicked Son, What Does He Say?" And Rav Sachs develops based on earlier texts, meaning earlier even than the Haggadah. The Haggadah was very, very old. But even earlier than that, looking at the Brisos, what he shows is that of the four sons, the one that really gets the attention of Chazal is the Rasha. And that's the one that we find most interesting also, I think. But he shows that the four sons is really just a building up of the Rasha as the core. And he observes that the story of the Rasha in these Midrashim was written at the time of the oppression of the Roman oppression, the Jewish people, before and after and immediately following the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, this Rasha who goes off, where do you think this Rasha was going? He was either joining the Romans, or he was joining the Christians as they were breaking away from the Jews, and he was putting aside the mitzvahs. And he says you kind of understand what's forcing him out. And he points to other Haggadahs throughout the ages. You'll read this essay, it's really very, very impactful. He points to Haggadahs throughout the medieval period and modern period that read the story of the Rasha into their own struggles during during the time of Spanish oppression in the Middle Ages, medieval period, or the time of Enlightenment in Western Europe. And he says, I want to offer a new reading of the Rasha. This is what Ray Sachs writes. I'm going to give you a new reading of the Rasha for our time. And you should read it. It's if you have children or you ever were a child, you should read this. You should read this this rendering of the Rasha. And he says that the reason the Rasha asks his parents, "Ma havoda zos lachem," what is the meaning of this mitzvah to you? He says to you, he doesn't include himself, is because he's at a time of questioning. He's at an inflection point, and he really is asking. He says, I never got this message from you. I don't understand why you keep these mitzvos. Why is it that you go to shul on Shabbos? I don't want to go to shul on Shabbos with you. Explain it to me. You keep telling me, and you keep educating me. You're pouring tens of thousands of dollars a year into my education. but I'm still not feeling it. And I'm not going to be committed in the way that you want me to be unless you tell me ma avodah zos lachem. He's challenging them, but he's asking, he's begging them. And he says, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but read how he explains Hakeashinav, set his teeth on edge, and how he connects it to the relationship between parents and children. And as a parent, this is a challenge to us. We need to live our Seder in a way that elevates those who are there. We have to live our Seder in a way that inspires those who are there so that when they ask their questions, they come away with an answer or at least an image of an experience that they can hold with them forever. The Seder is about images. It takes the most bland things, just psukim telling us to tell the story, and makes them into people, makes them into dynamics, makes them into systems. And we have to offer that to all those who are with us. And we have to challenge ourselves to make sure that we come out and those with us come out inspired and dedicated to the mitzvos that is the avodah hazos lanu.
Turn it over to Rabbi Kupferberg. Please unmute yourself.
That's a really powerful idea. The idea of we mentioned at the beginning, but the personification of different psukim is something that I'm going to be thinking about, and how it relates to other ideas. But I would let us just take a look at right at the beginning of the Haggadah, right after Vadam Hayinu, before we even really begin to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. We read in the Haggadah, "Afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu navonim, kulanu zekanim." Even if we were all wise and intelligent and knowledgeable in the Torah, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's a mitzvah for us to retell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And just thinking about why it was so important for the Haggadah to begin with that halacha, what it means to emphasize that even no matter what our religious identity is or how knowledgeable we are, that it's important for us to retell it. I came across a really beautiful idea from Rabbi Sachs that at least helped me understand the profundity of this little section. So this is from a chapter called "A Tale of Two Civilizations," and in it, Rabbi Sachs, as he is was wont to do, is reflecting on the longevity of the Jewish people, and he compares the fact that the pyramids of the ancient Egyptian civilization may still very well be here, but the civilization is long gone. And he notes that the really deep irony that the oldest, at least that we found, the oldest record of the Jewish people outside of the Torah is from something called the Bernepta Stele, which is an old kind of stone column from Paro-Menepta from around the year 1200 BCE. And there's one line, which is there, I think it's line 27, which is in which he tells of over his military victories. And about 4 words there are generally translated to mean that Israel is gone and the seed is destroyed. And talk about one of the premature Dewey defeats Truman moments in history, celebrating the victory over the vanquishing of the Jewish people already 3,200 years ago. And Rabbi Sachs, at least in this essay, offering at least one reason for our longevity, points to Moshe Rabbeinu's first speeches to the Jewish people on the eve of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And Moshe Rabbeinu at this moment has the choice to emphasize many different things. He could have emphasized the value of freedom. He could have emphasized the long journey that lay ahead of them. He could have talked about the wonders of the land that was flowing with milk and honey. But 3 times in his first speeches to the Jewish people, Moshe talks about the Haggadah Telebincha, but the idea of telling your children, about preserving the memory of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And in fact, Rabbi Sachs says, and I've never seen this formulated this way, but it's such a powerful idea. He says the Israelites were told that they were about to become a nation of educators. And just a couple lines later, he writes, really underscoring this idea, writes, to defend a land, you need an army, but to defend freedom, you need education. And we've been able to preserve the values of the Jewish people and our Torah and these ideals that we've been able to spread throughout the world, which Rabbi Sachs, perhaps more than anyone in I don't know if we can think of someone who has been able to spread the values like Rabbi Sachs, who was an educator par excellence. It's because we are and have been a nation of educators. Over the past couple of weeks, I've just been calling different friends of mine from yeshiva mostly, and most of the substance of a conversation is just sharing different ideas that we're going to tell over at the Pesach Seder that we're thinking about. And when I speak to people in Shul, people will come over to me and tell me their Divrei Torah and things that they're thinking about. And it just shows how being an educator is something that's not specific to whatever else your identity is in Judaism. But being a Jew means that part of your responsibility is to educate everyone around you, no matter how much you know and no matter how much they know. And I thought this is why I think, just Sachs doesn't make this connection, but I think this is the case, that this is why we begin the Haggadah with this idea. Because before we even begin to tell the story and talk about our longevity, it's important to recognize why we got there. And that's because mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim v'chol amar b'lesaper reisim v'shabach, is that this is what makes us worthy of praise, that we've taken upon ourselves this responsibility. No matter who we are, no matter what our identity is, we are all a nation of educators.
Rabbi Gnack, back to you.
Okay, great. So, I actually want to go a little bit out of order. Because at this point, while we are, saying the Haggadah, so the kids are running around looking for the Afikomen. And so I want to share with you something that I saw quoted in Rav Nevensal's Haggadah. It's a new Haggadah for this year that I got as a gift. Now, Rav Nevensal is a Talmud of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a tremendous Talmud Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he has a comment on a comment that Rav Shlomo Zalman made. So Rav Shlomo Zalman was upset that people have their children steal the Afikomen. And he says he thinks it's wrong because we're teaching our children to steal. He said, what kind of chinuch is that? So he says you shouldn't steal the Afikomen. And the truth is that this, personally, I don't hide the Afikomen. Sometimes I have a decoy, like I have the real Afikomen, and then I'll have a decoy that if the kids steal it, they'll not get the real one. And the reason for that is actually a different reason. Some of the other poskim are concerned about hiding the Afikomen because they say the Afikomen either needs to be on the table because lechem she'on will have dvarim harbe, it's the bread that we talk about. So if it's hidden in the living room under a cushion and somebody's going to fall asleep on the couch and crush it to pieces, so then you're not discussing the lechem oni with the matzah there. And another concern is that the halach is that the Afikomen represents the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach needs to be guarded. You have to be watching the Korban Pesach. You're not allowed to just leave it. So they say if you hide your Afikomen in a different room, you're not watching the Afikomen properly. So those are reasons why I don't hide the Afikomen. But the Shlomo Zalman said he's very disappointed with this minhag because he says it teaches our children to steal. And if Nevensal, who's a student, says he doesn't understand what Shlomo Zalman was saying. He says, because we're not teaching our kids to be thieves. He says we're teaching them to be excited about the Seder. The way they get excited about the Seder is playing hide and seek or playing games with the Afikomen. He says, Kol HaKavod, that's great. So he doesn't understand what Shlomo Zalman was disturbed by. So I want to share a thought of what Shlomo Zalman was disturbed by, why he didn't like the minhag of hiding but really stealing the Afikomen. And I think that he wasn't concerned that people are hiding and looking for it. That's fine. That's great. He was concerned with the framing of it. We're framing it as stealing the Afikomen. And because thievery is it's so anathema to what the Jewish people are, that how could you even say that? I mean, would you say, we're going to eat the chametz and like we pretend like it's chametz? Of course not. We don't even say such things. How could you say that you're going to eat chametz even as a game? How could you say that you're going to steal the afikomen? And what he was saying is that had you framed the game differently, it would have been great chinuch. But to frame it in a way that highlights a midah, which is a midah that's not a Jewish midah, that's not something that we want to inculcate into our children and incorporate into our Seder. So that's the problem. I was talking to one of my students today, and he said that they do hide and look for the afikomen. I told him this observation, and he said that in his family they do hide it, but they don't get an afikomen present for finding or giving back the afikomen. He said his father introduced a new minhag into their family. They get a rechush gadol present. I said, what do you mean? He says, because the Torah tells us that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they left rechush gadol. They left with this tremendous wealth of Egypt. They carried it out on their backs and on their donkeys, and their children carried it. And he says, to commemorate the to commemorate the nace and the care that Hashem showed the Jewish people, they have a not an afikomen present, but a rechush gadol. So it's the idea of reframing it in a way that's positive, that's commemorative, that really develops the midos that we're trying to teach at the Seder, I thought was really so beautiful. And I assume most people most people over here do hide and look for and seek the afikomen, but maybe this year let's not call it stealing the afikomen. Let's call it searching for and being excited about the mitzvah of eating the afikomen.
Rabbi Kuferberg, we're back to you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Genack. Thank you, Rabbi Zirkin. One of the things I miss most is the fun of stealing the afikomen, and it's not the same anymore. I don't know why. Like, it just competing against like my 11-year-old siblings. It's just, I don't know, for some reason I feel like I'm missing something now.
They don't feel like they think they want you to compete.
I have had fun in recent years trying to stop my siblings from stealing my afikomen, and then I have to hide mine. So I've been able to like recover it, but it's just not the same if there's not going to be an afikomen present at the end of the day.
You're probably makbid to have your afikomen on the table the whole time, right?
I have been hiding it near the table. I'm not going to give away where it is in case you're in cahoots with my siblings. So don't want to give too much information.
They're for sure watching right now. So exactly for that reason. In our family, we would rotate. So one night my father would hide the afikomen from us, and then the other night we would have to hide the afikomen from him. A little bit of both.
So one time my nephew, this was at the Seder, the whole family was there. It's probably 15 years ago, maybe less, 10 years ago. My nephew found the afikomen, and then he hid it, and then he fell asleep.
Right.
That kind of story where the afikomen gets lost from being hidden is second as popular to people who say they turned on their air conditioning units and crackers flew out. There's like the two most standard stories about Pesach that happen to every family that has central air or air conditioning units that hides the afikomen or doesn't. I think it sounds like we could do a whole symposium here on the art of hiding the afikomen, but I think it's probably best if we move forward.
Okay, well, speaking of children, it's very clear in the Haggadah that the children play a really central role in the night of the Seder and the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, and in particular, the questions that children ask. And this is an idea that I talked about a bit on Shabbos, and talked about how the questions of children helps us understand the nature of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim and the history of the development of the Haggadah and how it characterizes that mitzvah. But tonight I want to use that idea to explain the key difference between the Chacham and the Rasha. So what exactly typifies the questions that children ask? Adults ask questions too, right? We ask questions all the time for many different reasons, sometimes because we don't understand something, or because we're confused, or because we want to challenge someone. But what would you say would be the key identifying characteristic of a child's question? What makes something a child's question? And thinking about this, I think it's the idea that as children, we enter such an unfamiliar world, and we're so uncertain of our place within it, right? Children are talking all the time about what they want to be when they grow up, right? And it's because they don't know yet what the life, they're at the background of the questions that children are asking. What is this? What does this mean? Why do we do this? In the background of all those questions, it seems to be there's lurking a much bigger question, which is, what is this life that I have been given? What does it mean to be me? What am I going to find in this life? And they don't yet have kind of the map of their life worked out yet. There are a lot of blank spaces they're still trying to fill in. And as Jews, as Jewish children, Jewish adults, we can ask this question two ways. We can ask a more broad question, what is this life that I've been given? Or specifically, what is this Jewish life that I have been given? And we see that within the questions of the Arba Banim. So the Tam, the simple son, Mazos, he asks, what is this? He hasn't yet developed a perspective on what it means for him to be Jewish, or what it means for him to perform the mitzvot, so to have a relationship with Hashem, or to daven, or to do any parts of Judaism. But the Chacham and the Rasha have developed different perspectives, and they diverge from each other, right? So the Chacham is invested in Judaism. His question is, I see what I have been given. I see there are Eidos and Chukim HaMishpatim. I see there's all these different aspects that characterize my Judaism, and I'm interested in them. I'm interested in knowing their value and what they mean. The Rasha's question is the opposite, though. The implication of the Rasha's question, Ma avoda hazos, or in the Yerushalmi, when the Rasha's question is formulated, it's formulated in the sense of tircha. What is this burden that you have placed upon me? What are all these annoying things that I have to do tonight? And then the implication of the Rasha's question is that I don't want this. I don't want this Jewish life that I have been given. And one of the things that the Haggadah inculcates within us by asking us, or trying to get us to see Judaism through the prism of children, is to get us to ask the question, what is this Jewish life that we have been given? And how are we going to relate to it? The Rambam, when he begins to lay out the halachos of brachos in the Mishnah Torah, begins by saying, after he mentions that we make brachos on foods that we eat, or other times we take specific pleasures in the world, he says that just as you make a bracha when you experience different pleasures like eating, you also make a bracha when you do mitzvahs. And the Rambam is drawing an analogy between the excitement or the enjoyment or the anticipation you feel when you're about to eat something delicious to when you're about to do a mitzvah. And so part of the Seder, I think, and part of the mitzvah of Sibur Tiyas Mitzrayim is to pause for a moment, to take a step back and look at this Torah that we have been given, and to ask, and for us to ask this question as if we're experiencing it for the first time, and say, what does it mean to us? What have we been given, and how are we going to relate to it? Are we going to make a bracha on the mitzvos? Are we going to approach them with excitement? Are we going to be invested in finding out meaning? Is it something that we're more interested in? Or, Chas v'shalom, like the Rasha, are we going to choose to implicitly assume that it isn't meaningful for us? And that, I think, is one of the key ideas the Haggadah is trying to inculcate by asking us to view the mitzvos through the minds of children.
One of the drushos that we study in the middle of the Maggid section is when the Haggadah addresses the pasuk of Vayered Mitzrayma Vayagar Sham Bimsein Ma'at. And it's interesting to think about where this drasha is coming from, or what Chazal's mindset was. Why were we in Egypt in the first place? Is kind of a basic question that the Haggadah touches on. And maybe a different way of formulating that very same question would be, why were we still in Mitzrayim? Whose fault is this whole circumstance, this centuries of slavery? Yosef went down to Mitzrayim, but it's not really his fault because his brothers sent him down. And then the family goes down to Mitzrayim. That's not the Egyptians' fault. It was a time of famine. The Jews were the beneficiaries of it. So in some ways, we're ashamed to be in Egypt, and in other ways, we're really excited to be We were lucky, fortunate enough to be in Egypt. In some ways, we owe the Egyptians. In some way, the Egyptians owed us. It's kind of a complicated start to a relationship that at the end becomes very black and white because of the abuses and atrocities that took place. But Chazal don't shy away from thinking about this issue. Why were we in Egypt? Did we want to be in Egypt? How did this whole thing begin? And the Haggadah darshans the pasuk Vayagor Sham, the lashon of Gerus, Melamed Shelo Yard Yaakov Avinu Lishtakeh b'Mitzrayim Ela Lagor Sham. Yaakov Avinu didn't say, I'm going to leave the land of Israel forever and move myself permanently to Egypt. I'm just going for a short time. Lagor ba'aretz banu ki ein mireh latzon la'im. It's not a good time for us in Israel. We're just going to come try Egypt for a little while, and then we're going to go back home. So is that really true if you look back at the end of Sefer Bereshis? Hashem tells Yaakov Avinu, don't worry. Anochi eredim cha Mitzrayim v'anochi alcha amalo. I'll go down with you. I'll come back with you. He reassures Yaakov that his future is not in Egypt. But in the same way that we don't see Yosef running back to tell his family that he's alive and well, we don't see Yaakov Avinu saying, can you please, we've been here long enough. I'm Yosef, I'm happy you're well. You should write more often. We're going to go back now. Can you send us back with some food and more wagons? They just seem to settle. And thinking about how this acculturation happens is a very important point of the beginning of the story. So what does the Haggadah mean, this drasha of Chazal, when it emphasizes for us that they had no intention of being there, when Yaakov Avinu didn't ask to leave? So Rabbi Sachs says the emphasis should be, you can find this comment at the bottom of page 48. Rabbi Sachs says it wasn't in his life, but it was in Yaakov Avinu's death. When Yaakov Avinu insists that the family, Yosef, make sure that he be brought back to be buried in the land of Israel, even though he had apparently already come to terms with the fact that the rest of his life would be spent in Mitzrayim, Yaakov fulfilled what we describe as Vayagor Sham. That even if for the rest of his living years he's going to be there, this is not his home. His home is going to be in the land of Israel, and Yosef internalizes that message, and he lived in Mitzrayim longer than any of them, insisting himself that I be brought back and buried in the land of Israel as well. And I was just thinking about Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership in the process of the Exodus and searching for the Atzmos Yosef in the beautiful way that Chazal describe it, is also a fulfillment of Vayagor Sham. Yaakov taught the lesson that I will not be buried here, I will be buried there. Yosef wanted to follow his father's footsteps, and Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who made it happen. The beautiful way in which Chazal described that the rest of the Jewish people were looking around during Makas Choshech for, as Rabbi Gnak mentioned before, the Rechush Gadol, how they were going to be wealthy, what they were going to walk out with, and at the same time, Chacham Lev Yikach Mitzvos, Moshe Rabbeinu, who was wise of heart, is not searching for wealth, but he's searching for reward. He's searching for redemption. He's searching to help Yosef fulfill that commitment that Israel was his home. It tells you something about Moshe Rabbeinu, who of course was born in Egypt and raised in the house of Paro, that he understood in seeing the oppression of the Jewish people that they were not home, even though home was somewhere that he had never experienced and never would. And that is really powerful. And we as Jews who go through the story of reading the Haggadah every year, many, many, many generations, perhaps more generations, have celebrated Pesach in exile than have celebrated Pesach in an autonomous Eretz Yisrael. And yet we still continue to fulfill the lesson of Yaakov Avinu Vayagor Sham in the same way that Yosef fulfilled it for him and Moshe fulfilled it for Yosef. It was the ultimate mitzvah, it was the ultimate gift to fulfill Yosef's dream of being returned and buried properly like his father back in Eretz Yisrael. And it has been the dream of Jews throughout the centuries who have read this story every year on Pesach and reminded themselves, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Turn it back to Rabbi Kupferberg.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I want to jump ahead a bit to Dayenu. I know every family has their own traditions and what they do at the Seder and their own little idiosyncrasies. So one thing that probably started about 10, 15 years ago among my siblings at my parents' Seder table was that my siblings would read aloud a little section that's found in I think it's the Art Scrolls Children's Haggadah. It's one of it's this big art scroll soft cover Haggadah that would ask a question in one line in Dayenu, where we say that even if Hashem would have brought us in front of Har Sinai and not given us the Torah, it would still be enough to thank him, Dayenu. And the art little asks that it probably wouldn't have been. Like, why is that? Why would that have been sufficient for us? What would we have gained by just standing in front of Har Sinai and not actually receiving the Torah? And the Arzal gives a little answer about how gives an analogy about walking into a perfume shop but not actually buying any perfume. You still come out smelling nice. And then I actually found a video on YouTube about 5 years ago it's a hilarious video. It's called Stuff People Say at the Seder, and it really typifies the type of Seder that I grew up with. And someone is saying that's Dvar Torah in that Seder. So apparently this is not only my family where this is a very common occurrence. But what I think animates, or at least was caused the popularity of this question, is that Dayenu does seem to be a little bit, I don't know, not entirely precise and true. Would it really have been enough if, for instance, we got the spoils from Egypt, but Hashem didn't split the sea? I mean, the Egyptians were chasing us. We would have been devoured. Or would it really have been enough if Hashem split the sea, but and caused to split up the Egyptians, but didn't actually provide us sustenance while we were in the desert? We would have starved and we would have starved and been parched. And I want to offer, I think, two ideas that can address this question of why we're actually saying Dayenu when it doesn't seem to be entirely true. So the first is something that I think Rabbi Gnack already touched on tonight, is that during the Haggadah is really like a textual time machine. Because we get to go through history, and the Haggadah starts from being much smaller as we can find the Haggadah in the Mishnah. And throughout the generations, we pick up all these different things. We pick up Dayenu comes in at one point, and Shol Chamascha comes in at a different point, and we get to my favorite Jewish drinking songs, Haggadah and Echad Miyodeh, where they're added later. They come at the end, and that's what the Haggadah really is. And a lot of what we do with the night of Pesach is orienting ourselves in time between a past and a future, and think about what it's like to be in that position. And so, for instance, we have the idea of we're supposed to see ourselves as if we left Egypt, we're supposed to return to the moment of the Exodus itself. When we say Arami Ovid Avi, so the original context of the entire paragraph of Arami Ovid Avi was when a farmer brought Bikurim in the land of Israel, he was supposed to say over Arami Ovid Avi. And so we visit his perspective when we say those words. And during Dayenu, we revisit all the different stops along the journey of Bnei Yisrael's journey out of Mitzrayim. And when we do that, when we orient ourselves in a specific point in time, and between a past and a future, there are a lot of different ways that experience can be colored. So when we look at the past, we can do so with nostalgia, we can do so with regret, we can do so with pride. And we look at the future, we can look at the future with many different ways. A lot of Pesach is a lot of preparation. So we do a lot of time thinking about what our Pesach is going to be like before Pesach. And that can come with anticipation, that can come with excitement, that can come with anxiety, and the many different times where it's appropriate to look at the future in many different ways. But what Dayenu is inculcating within us is the idea that sometimes it's important to look at the future with gratitude. That even when the future and the future redemption is uncertain, and all we have is just the potential for something to be great, but it hasn't happened yet, it's still so important to move forward with a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for what's happened in the past, and gratitude for the potential that things could be redeemed even greater in the future. And so when we revisit those points along the way, what we do in Dayenu is to show that gratitude, to inculcate that idea within us, that we don't only look to the past with gratitude, but we move forward into the future with that same mindset. Second, like another idea that came to mind this year as I was thinking about Dayenu, the way of addressing this question of why do we say Dayenu if it doesn't seem to be true? And I think this is actually probably closer to the original intention of the author of Dayenu. And that's that asking the question really misses the point. Who cares if it really would have been Diana? Because when you're in any relationship, there's always some negotiation that has to be going on, right? You have to negotiate how much responsibility you want to take on yourself, how much responsibility from the other party you're going to demand, how much gratitude you're going to give, how much appreciation you want to expect, and you have to draw the line somewhere. And so when you want to be thankful for something, you want to be thankful for anyone you're in a relationship with, you have to make a decision. How precise do you want to be in your thanks? Do you want to say, I'm only going to thank you for exactly as much as I think you deserve? Is that how you're going to build your relationship? Or are you going to be more generous of spirit and be more magnanimous and say, you know what? Maybe it wasn't the most amazing thing. Maybe you could have done more. But I still want to be exuberantly thankful. And so when I sing Dayenu this year, don't bother me with your questions of would it have been enough? That's not the point. The point is I want to thank Hashem, and I want to do so in the most exuberant way possible. And don't stop me by negotiating how precise I should be on this side of the line. I'm going to err on the side of gratitude. And I think this is what should, animate our joy when we sing Dayenu. That this is the type of people we want to be. The type of people who are grateful, even when someone looks at us and says, you really want to be grateful for that? The answer is yes, I do.
Well, it's almost 9 o'clock and we're not halfway through the Haggadah and I'm starving, which sounds really familiar. I have to admit, I feel like if I was having a Seder with the Knacks and the Kupferbergs, it would go on forever, but not tonight. Tonight is just a warm-up. So I want to share one final Dvar Torah with you, and I would love to do Seder with the Knacks and the Kupferbergs. I just want to say that would be amazing. I would just have to go
It's
to the
soon
10
time
o'clock. What's
soon
that?
it's time for me to go to sleep on the couch.
I was going to say, as long as there's a 10 o'clock abbreviated COVID minion that follows, I think I'll be fine to stay up late tonight. I want to share one final idea with you this evening that was new to me. I have a strange feeling that this question is something that you and your families may have asked before, but it was not a question that I can recall having ever thought about. The Mishnah in Psachim, in Arvei Psachim, at the very end of the Masechta, talks about Rabbi Gamliel's opinion that there are three essential elements to the Seder. You have to talk about Pesach, you have to say matzah, and you have to say maror. And then the Mishnah goes on to explain why we have each of these three elements at the Haggadah, at the Seder. Pesach al Shema, Shepasach Hashem al Batei Bnei Yisrael. Matzah al Shema al Shem Shelo Hispik. And then Marar al Shema al Shem Shemeru HaMitzrim. We all know the answers to this question. But there is a slight variation between the language of the Mishnah and the way that it appears in our Haggadah. And again, this may be something that your families talk about every year. The Mishnah says, Pesach al Shema, why do we have a carbon Pesach? And the language of the Haggadah is Pesach shahayu ochlin bisman shebeis hamikdash hayakayam al Shema. We add a line there into the text of the Mishnah. We say this carbon Pesach that our ancestors used to eat in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. Why did they eat it? Now, for us in historical context, it makes a lot of sense because we're not eating a carbon Pesach, and maybe it feels natural. It wasn't part of the Mishnah because in the times of the Mishnah, they ate a carbon Pesach. So they weren't asking a theoretical question, why did Jews used to eat the carbon? They're asking, why do we eat it? Pesach al Shema, Matzah al Shema. But after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, now they're asking a historical question. Not why do we eat the Pesach, but why did they eat the Pesach? Because we don't have it anymore. Now, for those who study Psachim, you'll know it's always tricky, or if you're interested in the history of the Tanaim, to know which Rabbi Gamliel is which. So there was a Rabbi Gamliel in the times of the Beis Hamikdash and a Rabbi Gamliel after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, related to one another, grandfather, grandson, great-grandson, etc. So the working assumption is that this is Rabbi Gamliel talking to us after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And that's why we say, Shahayu Ochlin Bizman Shebeis Hamikdash Hayakayim. Maybe. But the Chida in his Haggadah, which for some reason I have on my shelf, I don't know where I got it, but the Chida's commentary to the Haggadah, he asked the question differently. It's true there's no Karban Pesach anymore. And it's true that we're not going to eat one this year. So we should ask about why they ate a Pesach. But who should we be asking about? The Jews of the Beis Hamikdash or the Israelites in Egypt? What should the Haggadah say? Pesach shahayu avosenu ochlen b'Mitzrayim al shema. Where did the story of the Karban begin? It began in Mitzrayim. So why don't we do that? Why are we talking about the Pesach of the Mikdash and not Pesach Mitzrayim? And the Chida's question is interesting. His answer, I think, is quite profound. The Chida says something amazing. Why did the Jews bring a Karban in Mitzrayim? And why did the Jews continue to bring that same Karban in the Beis Hamikdash? It's easy to say that they brought it for the same reason as one another, but the Chida suggests that that's not true. In that moment in Mitzrayim, the act of bringing a Karban Pesach was a daring and audacious act, slaughtering an animal that was considered to be divine or godly in the eyes of the Egyptians for people who lived a life that was totally culturally pagan. The Jews needed to extract themselves from the culture that they were in, and they demonstrated their commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu by shechting the Avodah Zarah of the people around them. Mishchu ukechu lachem tzon, which we talked about on Shabbos afternoon. Wipe your hands clean from all of the experiences of paganism through the process of bringing the Karban. This was a radical shift for Jews that didn't know anything about Jewish worship, only about Egyptian worship. This was a daring, rebellious act against the culture in which they lived. But fast forward decades, centuries later, and Jews are in the Beis Hamikdash and they're bringing Karban Pesach. Why are they doing it? Are they doing it because they still have to reject Egyptian gods of which they know nothing about? No. They bring a Karban Pesach, they call it a Karban Pesach. They are bringing a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash, which is similar to many other sacrifices that they bring to Hashem, with a very specific point, which is to thank Hashem for saving their firstborns on the night of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Both of the reasons are true, but they had different levels of meaning at different times in Jewish history. So the question is not, why did the Jews bring a Pesach in the times of Mitzrayim? Because the answer would be different. This is a time-bound question for the Jews living in the times of the Beis Hamikdash. They celebrated it because Hashem was Pasach al Batei B'nai Israel. God passed over the homes of the Jews and spared their children. The reason that I think this is such a creative and fascinating idea is because it touches on one of the most essential missions that we have in keeping the lessons of the Pesach Seder relevant every year. It has happened on a number of occasions that I have sat at the Pesach Seder with, let's say, less distinguished guests than Rabbi Genack and Rabbi Kupferberg. And they've been bored and said, I don't even know why we have to do this. You know, this is so ridiculous and it's so antiquated and it feels so old-fashioned. It's not relevant to me. And I think to myself how sad it is that they don't see the lessons of the Haggadah come to life. It is true that we are telling a very old story. And it is true that in a cynical kind of way that we've heard it over and over again. Sometimes I bemoan the fact that we don't have a good enough repertoire of new tunes. We're still singing the same old Dayenu, and in my house getting it wrong. We're still singing the same Echad Meodea, but nobody really knows how it's supposed to end. You know, we got Fihisha Amda finally came to life for us with a new powerful tune. That was something. We need Yishai Rebo. I mean, we need it to be brought to our moment. But there's so much timelessness if we allow ourselves to process the lessons of the Haggadah through the experiences of our day. Are we not thinking about poverty? Are we not thinking about exile? Are we not thinking about redemption? We are, just in different terms. Lashana Haba Yerushalayim means something different when there is a state of Israel to when there isn't a state of Israel. The Haggadah has changed. It is dynamic throughout history. It has been colored and decorated and interpreted in so many different ways throughout the centuries because the experience of the reader has been so different throughout Jewish history. And perhaps what the Chida is doing here is giving us license to read the Haggadah in our own contemporary way by showing us how the meaning of Pesach itself changed throughout the generations. There was a moment in time when the Korban Pesach meant one thing, and then there was a moment in time when the Korban Pesach meant something different, and that's okay. I remember when I thought about this, my head, I jumped into thinking about the Rambam's writings in the Moreh Nevuchim about Karbanos. And this is a much longer conversation for another time. But the Rambam tells us this is the reason we bring Karbanos. And then in another chapter, he says, this is the reason we bring Karbanos. We're slaughtering the gods of the cultures around us, or maybe perhaps that we felt bad that they all had ritual sacrifice and we didn't have ritual sacrifice. So Hashem said, you can have ritual sacrifice too. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim has all these different possibilities. And my favorite is when the Ramban writes in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, this is all terrible, and it's usher to read it, and it's usher to listen to it, it's terrible. But what the Rambam was trying to do more broadly is exactly what I think the Chida is doing here as well. What does Pesach mean to you now? I guarantee you it means something different to you in this moment than it did to them. Pesach means something different during a pandemic than it meant in the Zman of the Mikdash, and it meant something different in the Beis HaMikdash than it did in their homes when they were in Mitzrayim. If your Pesach Seder is exactly the same this year as it was last year, if your Pesach Seder in this generation is exactly the same as it was in the last generation, you have failed to a certain extent to have Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim in the right way. In the same way as Rabbi Berman taught us a few nights ago, that there is what he called a story within a story. We want to know how they celebrated Pesach in Mitzrayim. We want to know how they celebrated Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash. We want to know how the Tanaim celebrated Pesach when they were in exile. And we have added commentary after commentary and value after idea, leading up to the state of Israel, leading up to surviving the Shoah, leading up to a pandemic, and thinking about quarantine and all of these things that we did last year as well. Our Haggadah needs to be dynamic because we as a people are dynamic. We're always changing. And the idea that Judaism challenges us to do the most is balance between the rootedness of our tradition and the dynamics of moving forward into our future. So my hope for all of us, first and foremost, is that everyone was able to take some notes tonight or spark some ideas that I hope will lead to meaningful conversation for your families, and in particular, different conversations relative to the ones from previous years. But I also hope that we are cognizant of the fact that it is still a strange year for us. Pesach this year is not quite what we hoped it would be. And we continue to daven for the ultimate redemption with that capital R, redemption from COVID, redemption from the limitations of the present moment, and hopefully redemption to the ultimate Geula, which is what Pesach is really all about. May we continue to study, find opportunities to be creative and to innovate through the language and the text of the Haggadah. May the tradition of this beautiful text inspire us to find new ways to grapple with the challenges of today. I want to thank everybody for joining. As always, thank you to Susan and David for making tonight possible, to our staff, to Oren and Sam for helping us with the technology, to Rabbi Genak and Rabbi Kupferberg, Yasher Koach to you both. Please be in touch with us if you're still making your plans for Pesach and you're going to be here in Riverdale in particular. We'd be happy to be of as much help as we possibly can be to make a meaningful Pesach for one and all. Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and we look forward to seeing you at the RJC very soon. Have a great night.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Nate. It was a lovely hour spent. Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Very enjoyable.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for the wonderful comments in the chat.
A wonderful Pesach, everyone.
Amen.
Chag Kash v'Sameach. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Kupferberg, and Rabbi Zirkin, and you did very Torah. Beautiful.
All three. Wonderful.
Okay, we'll have to